So David is numbering the people. This is a way of saying that he's organizing his army. He's appointing captains of thousands, captains of hundreds. We can probably assume that many of those who are rallying to the side of David were not necessarily experienced military types. And David is probably using this several weeks that he has at his disposal to run kind of a crash boot camp, training in which these people are being schooled in the art of warfare, and they're going to be fighting alongside those battle-hardened, time-tested warriors who have been with David for a good long time. Absalom may be coming with greater numbers, but it's certainly the case that David will have the greater experience, and in the end that's going to be the determining factor. David sent out a third of those under Joab, a third under Zeruiah, a third under Ittai. We talked about him last week, proposing that he should go out with them himself. Most likely, David assigned the 2/3 to his two nephews, to indigenous Israelites. He also had a fair number of people who had come to him from other places, foreigners, and they were probably assigned to Ittai. They all had something in common, namely that they had come in from outside, from other areas, and had sworn loyalty to David, and thus they all had that as a common sort of understanding of each other. David is proposing here to lead them into battle. That would be a typical way for a king to behave, to take his people out and to lead them into the conflict. The people said, "You're not going to go out." They, of course, voiced the clear principle that David is worth more than many, many thousands of them. If he is lost in the battle, then the whole purpose of this war is lost with him. The fact that the people can overrule David at this point is an interesting detail worth at least noting in passing. If you look at ancient Near Eastern civilizations at about the time that these events took place, around, in very round numbers, 1000 BC, you will not find any other civilization where you'd have something like a constitutional monarchy. That is to say, a monarchy where the king himself is under law. Moses had put the rule in place. Deuteronomy 17 gave what's called the king's law. And the kings in Israel were bound by law, not only the laws that applied to everybody else, but special rules. Somebody once said the king in Israel was the least free person in the whole place because he had extra rules that applied only to him. At this point, David is proposing to go out and the people overrule him. In some places that could never happen. The king's word becomes the law, end of conversation. But here David is willing to submit to the decision that is being made by them, and so he's going to be left waiting in this fortified city, probably commanding a reserve force that was left there to defend the city, but the others are going to go out into this battle. They, of course, voice the clear point that David is the whole treasure in this matter. There had actually been a rule that had been established earlier in Israel's history when David had gone into battle and had become so fatigued that it actually represented a peril to his welfare. And they passed a rule at the time, David is never going to go into battle again. And so the language they use, lest the light of Israel be extinguished. And they realized what a special individual David was and how much his life was to be protected, and so they had put that practical rule into place. So one commentator, sort of reflecting on this moment in the story, said, quote, "There's no calculating the value of a great leader, worth 10,000 of those under his command. Napoleon's presence with his troops was said to be worth several divisions. James Treslow Adams said of George Washington, quote, "As a man who by sheer force of character held a divided and disorganized country together until the victory was achieved, and who after peace was won still held his disunited countrymen by their love and respect and admiration for himself until the nation was welded into enduring strength and unity." That George Washington, who was generally not regarded as the brightest of the fathers, James Madison, Hamilton, others were clearly more politically genius, but somehow Washington, by his by the very weight of his character, by his integrity, by his courage, by his evident faith, somehow commanded a loyalty among people that very few others in history have been able to generate. And so in many ways we are certainly well within our bounds to call him the father of our country. And that gives me an excuse to mention that after we finish Revelation, if I don't die of old age by then, I want to do one short series, maybe just a year, and I'm going to call it Presbyterians and the American Revolution. Okay? Now, my thesis is that the American Revolution, at least humanly speaking, would much less likely have occurred were it not for the Presbyterians. I plan to prove that to you then. I'm just saying it to you now. But the course is going to be, the recipe is going to be 1/4 Bible, 1/4 theology, 1/4 church history, 1/4 civics. And altogether, I think it'll be interesting to see how that aspect of our own history played out. So anyway, I mentioned that in connection with George Washington, who was an Anglican, I'll grant you that. But I think there was a little Presbyterian in him when it came to being the commander of our forces. Anyway, this commentator concludes his remarks here. If that was true of Washington, then how much more is it true of Christ? I mentioned to you last week that in the book of Revelation, 7 times we hear the phrase, every language, tribe, nation, and people. Language, tribe, nation, and people. Some of you Christian people have traveled the world and met Christian people at various parts of planet Earth. And regardless of skin color, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of background, in many other variables that of course distinguish us, something that ties us together more profoundly than all those things that make us differ is a common faith in Christ. And it is something of a remarkable thing that we can join in a cause that is bigger than simply national interests or political agendas when it comes to our common faith in Christ. In some ways, David is an example of that, the fact that he sort of commanded that rallying point among the people that served under him. Well, the king complied. Whatever seems best to you, I will do, he said. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and thousands. Now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, please, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. As we said, the king is at this point complying with the demands of the people, but he still leaves one command on the table. Deal gently with Absalom. Absalom wanted to kill his father. David, on the other hand, as one guy said, could only think of his boy. And in some ways, he's putting the interests, the welfare of Absalom, even above the interests of his own kingdom. And that almost creates a catastrophe in itself, as we'll see soon enough. Well, the word that David had spoken was passed through the ranks so that everybody was aware of it before they went out to the battlefield, that Absalom, in spite of the atrocious behavior in mounting a coup d'etat against his own father, was nevertheless to be somehow protected in the conflict. It didn't turn out that way, as you probably know, but that was David's interest. So the people went out into the field of battle against Israel. Now I'm going to insert a little kind of footnote here. It becomes more clear later, but I think it helps us get what's going on to understand kind of the lay of the land. As we were saying earlier, Absalom has been waiting around for a while. He's been there in Jerusalem enjoying being the king for a day, you know, that show that used to be on TV, Queen for a Day. He's been king for a month. And he's enjoying all of that, but he knows he has this business to deal with. David has been preparing. He knows inevitably the conflict must be joined. And the expectation, it seems, on the part of Absalom and Amasa was that they were going to take this force across the Jordan, probably the same place David had, the fords of the Jordan, that they were going to then march north and probably find David holed up in Mahanaim, a fortified city. It'd be a logical place for him to sort of protect himself. and try to withstand a siege. And so Absalom and his commander Amasa are expecting a siege to be the next order of business. And they're hoping to starve out the people in that city and make them break under pressure and finally deliver David over for whatever he's going to face at the hands of his son Absalom. So that's what they're expecting. Joab is a brilliant tactician and probably knows that's what they're expecting, and so he has a different plan, namely that though he is supposed to be the defensive side of this, he's going to become the attacker in a kind of surprise attack, while these guys are in the midst of a fairly thick, wooded area of rather rough terrain. And he knows that if he can kind of spring the trap right then, when they're not expecting it, that it's going to throw them into a bit of a panic, as indeed it does. So if you think about it in those terms, then it'll make this following paragraph make a bit more sense. The people, referring to the people under David's authority, the people went out into the field of battle against Israel. There's a little bit of a surprise element there, that they're going out against the people who are supposed to be coming against them. You see, that's kind of the unexpected little twist. The battle was in the woods of Ephraim. So it's a wooded area, not a great place typically to fight a battle. Usually you fight battles on battlefields, on open areas where both sides have some maneuvering room. But Joab knows, with his superior fighting forces and the experience he has, that he can use these woods to his advantage. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. And so we have some very astute military strategy. It's kind of hiding just beneath the surface of this description for us. It's an unexpected attack in which David's forces are taking the initiative. We're expecting them to defend. Usually you're better off defending than attacking, but Joab knows this is a case where there's an exception. If he can catch these people unexpectedly in this place. Absalom and Amasa thought they were going to a siege. Much to their surprise, they find themselves in the middle of this rugged terrain under attack. Well, the attack probably threw these who were serving under Absalom into a bit of a panic. And in the panic, they're running here and there, trying to figure out what to do. They don't have any way to form themselves in a battle array. And so the whole business becomes a kind of meltdown of panic in the face of this attack from behind trees and so on by these who are serving under Joab and the others with him. One commentator who had a military background, as I understand it, made this remark about the whole thing. He said, Joab had brilliantly picked the battleground, knowing that the land itself would be as effective as his crack troops in a defensive conflict. Absalom and Amasa should have seen it coming, but pride and inexperience blinded both of them. And then the commentator pushed the point a little bit further in an interesting way. He said, Christians should not be caught unawares in the conflicts of this world. We should pick the battleground rather than allowing the battleground to be picked for us. As Jesus went into battle in full control of the ground and the terms. I think you know that the Christian movement down through history has, of course, represented a population of people that have lived in many cultures at many times, many civilizations, varying dramatically from one century to the next, from one place to the next. There's never been a time when Christian people have not been subjected to the pot shots, and indeed sometimes the cheap shots, of a culture that is hostile to them. And it's easy to get distracted. It's easy to see somebody saying something against the Christian movement in the press or elsewhere, and to get all messed up and kind of exercised about it as if we have to go and die on that hill. We don't have to die on every hill, you see. There are some hills worth dying on, some aren't. And we as Christian people should be very selective when we're going to go to battle against a culture. Now, we are countercultural people, and there's a battle going on. So it's not to minimize that, but there's also a strategy to our thinking about how we engage the culture. And sometimes if we allow ourselves to be distracted by matters that are of secondary importance, then we can, kind of win that little battle and lose the war sort of thing. And I think this is a good application of that tactic that we see in the case of Joab. Anyway, Absalom himself, surprised, met the servants of David. He was riding on a mule. Israel didn't have many horses. Horses were battles of aggressive warfare, and Israel was more of a defensively oriented nation. So mules and donkeys were a standard mode of transportation. And so he's riding along comfortably enough on a mule when all of a sudden he spots off in the distance the forces representing his father David, and he himself was probably caught in a bit of a panic as he realizes, whoa, the fight is here. He thought he was going to find them there, and all of a sudden here they are right in his face. And so he, turning around, trying to get away, trying to go back and warn his people, whatever, gets his head caught in a terebinth tree. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth. And the mule, which was under him, just went on. It's a great sight, isn't it? Well, he comes upon them by chance. He was probably traveling in a leisurely fashion. The army is not arrayed for a battle. It's not set up to go into battle. They're just kind of picking their way through the woods, you see. And Absalom, probably out in front, not expecting this kind of engagement, all of a sudden finds himself here. And we learn that he is surprised, presumably, we can kind of read that in, by the unexpected appearance of these forces, turns around, maybe in a bit of a panic, going back, trying to escape from this, trying to warn the others. Now, when I heard this story in my little Sunday school as a kid, and it was one of my favorites, I have to say, my Sunday school teacher taught me, and I believed it. I'm going to admit to you, I believed it until I did this course, that Absalom got caught by his hair. I've never heard that. Those Sunday school teachers. Now, it doesn't say that it wasn't his hair. I'm willing to allow maybe it was that flowing hair that was coming off his head that got caught, as depicted here in my favorite flannel graph depicting this particular thing. But it doesn't say that. It says he got his head caught. And so I don't know if this is a major theological concern for you, You'll have to go work that out on your own. But nevertheless, one way or another, poor Absalom finds himself caught between heaven and earth. Those who are fighting behind him, facing this unexpected opposition, flee, and Absalom is left, if I can put it this way, twisting in the wind. And there he is. Well, a certain man saw it and went and told Joab, Joab, you're not going to believe it. Can you? I just saw Absalom hanging from a tree. And Joab's response was, you just saw him? Why didn't you kill him? Strike him right there to the ground. I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. I don't know. Somebody said that's worth a lot, so I'm going to take their word for it. But anyway, Joab, of course, thought that that was the opportunity. Of course, this man who had seen Absalom had heard the command of David and probably regarded it as a colossal act against his own interest to take the life of Absalom, in spite of the fact that he was at the head of this assault on David. Joab himself was acting beyond his orders to ask this man to kill him or even to kill him himself. But I think once again we have to say of Joab that he saw a little bit more of the big picture, maybe more than David did in the circumstances. David was very much concerned about his son, and it was partly because David cared about his son, as any father would, even when the son was rebellious, even when the son was mounting this attack that could cause the death of David. But even more deeply, David is seeing this as one more effect of his own misdeeds. And so the self-accusation that's going on here drives a great deal of David's lament over Absalom, because he sees that in some ways, finally, it's his own fault that all of these things have happened, including the actions of Absalom. And so his request to treat Absalom gently was partly for the sake of Absalom, but probably more because David was trying to prevent the sword from continuing to devour in his house, was trying to avoid that. Joab, for his part, saw that if Absalom were left alive, this war would keep going on. There was enough discontent in the empire that a living Absalom, even if he were exiled, even if he were imprisoned, even if he were subjected to ferocious punishment, would still be a rallying point, and that this conflict wouldn't end. And so Joab is prepared to overrule even the direct command of his own king in order to make sure that that instability doesn't continue to be a threat to the kingdom. Well, the man, of course, protesting to Joab says, look, if you were to give me 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I wouldn't raise my hand against the king's son. Come on. You heard it, I heard it. The king commanded you, Abishai, Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. The command was well known. This man knew it. He wasn't going to do something, in his view, so stupid as to disobey that order. He continues, otherwise I would be dealing falsely against my own life, because there's nothing hidden from the king. And I'm going to tell you something, Joab, you yourself would have set yourself against me if I had taken his life. So the man shows a little bit of savvy here. He knows the character of David. He knows the character of Joab. He knows that wouldn't have been a smart move on his part, no matter how you cut it. One said the infantryman was both an idealist and a realist. Idealist in his devotion to the word of the king, realist in his knowledge of Joab and his character. Joab had a single-minded and terrifyingly ruthless realism only. Though he acts in opposition to the king's command, he acts in behalf of the king's best interests. Absalom could not be spared and at the same time have any degree of real authority and unity return to David's rule. Joab did the dangerous, dirty work himself. So Joab said to this man, I can't waste any more time with you. He took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. Now the word that's used for spear actually is referring to a lesser weapon, more of a dart or a wooden staff, a little smaller. It had a sharpened point on it. As it turns out, it didn't actually kill Absalom, but it did mortally wound him. The reference to his heart may simply be referring to kind of the middle of his body or his torso there. And so Joab inflicts that injury on Absalom as he's hanging there rather pathetically from the branches of this terebinth. And then 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom, struck and killed him. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. So mortally wounded probably by Joab, but the job is finished off by these who were serving under his command. The trumpet blow had already been prearranged. This would be a standard way of sending a signal over a broad area. The trumpet would be recognizable as Joab's, and it would signal that the battle's over, that there's no further need nor desire for bloodshed because the object has been achieved. The people were held back, that is, the people serving under Joab. It might have gone a different way, because even though the battle was over in the sense that Absalom was dead, a vindictiveness on the part of Joab or on the part of David could have said, let's go chase down those miserable rebels and get rid of them. And there could have been a kind of punitive extension of this battle, but David had undoubtedly warned against it, and Joab knew it would serve no good purpose. He wanted to immediately do what he could to begin building a basis for reconciliation rather than to simply continue aggravating the hostility in the community. And so the sound of the trumpet meant it's over. No more fighting. Let these people go. Let them get away. They're fleeing already. Just let them get away. And that'll be that. So they took the body of Absalom, cast it into a large pit in the woods, and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. A pit covered by a large pile of stones, of course, was emblematic of condemnation and indeed of great ignominy for Absalom and his conduct in being responsible for this. The rest of those fighting under Absalom fled. They were, of course, fearing reprisals. They didn't know that there was a policy to just let them go home, so they are in a panic trying to escape the battlefield. The narrator gives us a little interesting footnote here in verse 18. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name. And to this day it's known as Absalom's monument. Absalom actually had 3 sons, but they all died apparently before his own death. And so he had no male children to carry on his name. He did have a daughter, Tamar. We've talked about her on other occasions. So he had set up this rather remarkable monument to honor himself. If you travel in the Holy Land, you'll see this. This ain't it. This was actually built in the Middle Ages. Some people have confused it and thought it was Absalom's monument, but actually it was built on a design that traces to a much later date, but nevertheless it goes by that name. The editorial note that's being made here by our author is to note that Absalom's tomb, his actual tomb, was very different from the one he had planned for himself. A kind of poetic justice sets in. He did get a lasting monument, but it wasn't anything like what he had anticipated or wanted. It became rather a great emblem of the bad things that he had done rather than any celebration of him as a great person. And so just an interesting side note there from our author here. Verse 19, then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, the priest, said, let me now run and take the news to the king, how the king has avenged him of his enemies. Josiah said to him, no. You are not going to take the news this day. You can take the news another day, almost like he's talking to a child, you know. You can do this another day. Today, you will take no news because the king's son is dead. Joab knew the fallout that was going to be coming from this. And he didn't want Ahimaaz, you know the old expression, shoot the messenger. He didn't want Ahimaaz to be the messenger that would be delivering that news. Joab said to the Cushite, who was a lesser ranking servant under Joab, go tell the king what you've seen. So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. I very much believe this Cushite was actually from, who are the people that always come over and win Bloomsday? Where are they? Kenya. I think he was from Kenya. You know those people, they're just so fast. And I think that's who this guy was, probably a descendant or was an ancestor of. But one way or another, the Cushite runs. African man serving under Joab takes off to bring the news. Ahimaaz probably, if we read between the lines, was planning to tell David everything. He was going to tell David that there had been a great victory on the battlefield, and he was also going to tell David, as part of that story, that Absalom had been killed in the process. And probably Ahimaaz thought that David would be disappointed to hear of the death of his son, but outweighing that would be his joy and relief and gratitude that there had been victory on the battlefield. Joab knew better. Joab knew that there was a single-minded obsession with David about the welfare of his son, and he knew that whoever delivered that message was going to be facing a meltdown of some sort or other on the part of David, and he wanted to spare Ahimaaz that dramatic confrontation. So he'd rather have a foreigner bring the news, a lesser-ranking person, a low-ranking servant who would bring that somewhat mixed message. Well, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, I'm not taking no for an answer. But whatever happens, he says, please let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, why? Why are you wanting to run, my son? You have no news ready. There's nothing that you can add to what the Cushite's going to say, and anything that you might add is only going to make it worse. Stay here. Just relax. But Ahimaaz says, no, I want to run. And so finally, Joab says, okay, run. And Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain, probably knowing the land a little better than the Cushite did. Ahimaaz went a little bit to the west and ran up the side of the Jordan River where it's fairly flat, so he could make a lot better time than the Cushite, who's making a beeline through this wooded, rough terrain. And so actually, as it turns out, Ahimaaz gets there first, you see. Now, David was sitting between the two gates. And the watchman went up to the roof over the gate, to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. The two gates are not side by side. This is a fortified city with a very thick wall, and so they would typically have an outer gate and an inner gate, creating a little space between them. And so David is in this semi-protected area inside that outer gate, but outside the inner gate. And so he's sitting there waiting. Of course, over this gate, which was the major entrance to that town, was a watchman's tower. And they would have guys up there with binoculars, and they'd be looking out for anybody who might be coming, friend or foe. And in this case, he's looking for the approach of somebody who's going to bring news from the battlefield. Well, as soon as he sees a little figure off on the horizon, he cried out and told the king, who's down below him. And the king said, well, if he's alone, there's news in his mouth. And this man, Ahimaaz, is coming rapidly, drawing near. The implication is there's good news in his mouth. One runner coming from the field of battle suggests that there's been victory. Many runners coming from the field suggest there's been defeat, and they're all, trying to escape the bloodbath. And so David at least is construing it so far as possibly favorable news from the battlefield. But then the watchman saw another man running. This is the Cushite, of course. And the watchman called to the gatekeeper below, who's supposed to open the gate on authority, and said, there's another man running alone. And the king says, whoa, interesting. Well, he also is bringing news. So the watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, because he was an Olympic champion. You understand? He was a runner, and he had a certain style that was apparently evident to the people who knew him. The king, of course, putting the best possible spin on this, says he's a good man. He must be bringing good news. It's unexpected. Two men coming from different directions. But again, David is hopeful. When he hears that it's Ahimaaz that is leading the way, he assumes the news must all be good, because Joab would never send a highly respected man to bring bad news. And so David's initial impression is not only is the battle won, but Absalom is safe. That's the way he's thinking about it. Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, all is well. Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. Literally, the Hebrew is from Ahimaaz, shalom, peace. And that word that implies rich peace. And so that's the greeting that he brings. And then he says the Lord has delivered. This Hebrew means hedged or trapped, meaning that Joab's plan had worked. They've been hedged in, as in a trap of some kind in the forest, is at least implied in the way that that term is used here. The king, of course, only has one thing on his mind. Is the young man Absalom safe? Now, Ahimaaz planned to tell the whole story. I think we can assume that. He thought he could couch it in a way that would be at least acceptable to the king. But now when the king's gaze hit his eyes, and Ahimaaz saw what was in his face and in his expression and in his concern, Ahimaaz wilted, flinched. And so he said, well, when Joab sent the king's servant, the Cushite, and me, Ahimaaz, your servant, I saw something going on. I saw some kind of turmoil, some tumult over there, but boy, I didn't know what it was about. And he just dodged the bullet, you see. Well, interestingly, Ahimaaz came up saying, Shalom, peace. And David's first question is, was it shalom for Absalom? That's the Hebrew word. Is it peace for Absalom? Of course, again, I think we can understand David is feeling partly a concern for his son, ne'er-do-well as he was, but he's also feeling an even deeper concern for himself because he blames himself big time for this whole catastrophe. And he just wants the news not to be as bad as it looks like it might be. Well, Ahimaaz sidesteps the issue. And so the king says, okay, stand over there, wait a minute. Well, along comes the Cushite. And the Cushite said, there's good news, my lord, the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who arose against you. Good news, not the word shalom now, but just good tidings is the way it's expressed. And again, the king puts the question to the Cushite, the young man Absalom, is he safe? And the Cushite, being as diplomatic as he can, of course, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. So, alarm for Absalom's well-being has dominated his mind. The diplomatic response, nevertheless, carries the message clearly enough, and David knows what has happened. One said, give credit to Ahimaaz that the tragic news should be broken by a friend. In the end, however, he didn't have the courage to tell the whole story. It was left to a common foot soldier to do that. And then he adds the gospel has good news, but also bad news. It can be sweet in the mouth, but bitter in the stomach. The entire story must be told if we are to have integrity in the task. We like to be fiduciaries of the Christian gospel, and it is good that we are happy to have that role. But it is possible for us to only tell part of the story. The good news, the word gospel means good news. But if we somehow sidestep the bad news that is also part of the content of the gospel, we sabotage the goodness of the good news. The most definitive summary of the Christian gospel in the whole Bible, the most comprehensive treatment of it, is Paul's letter to the Romans. As you know, the first thing Paul says as he begins to explain the content of the gospel is this: God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. No, you know better, don't you? The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who refuse to face up to what they know is true. It's revealed. That's where the gospel begins. You are in deep trouble. Now, if I come to believe that, then I have a little bit more appreciation for the good news. You mean God has made a way for me in spite of this peril in which I find myself? Ahimaaz sort of stands for a guy who wanted to tell the good part of the story but wilted when it came to the rest of it. And of course, the warning the commentator is giving us is, let's not be quite as Ahimaaz was in this occasion. We have the gospel, we have to tell the whole thing for it to really hang together and make sense in a world that desperately needs to hear it. The king, hearing this information, was deeply moved, went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. The language there suggests violent trembling, a lament that shook his whole body. You probably catch a glimpse of it in Psalms 38 and 40, where David talks about sin piling up over his head. David would happily have died in the place of his son, because he was feeling not only the grief of losing a son, but he was feeling the grief of his failure as a father. So the next chapter begins with Joab hearing this. Joab, of course, is still quite a ways away, but the word comes back to him soon enough. Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard it said that day, the king is grieved for his son. Joab was a bit conflicted himself. He's the one that had engineered the return of Absalom in the first place, hoping to make things better. It only made it worse, so he feels a little bit of the responsibility here, I'm sure. David is blaming himself for everything that had occurred. But the problem is, for the king to be mourning in the face of a great victory fought courageously by people acting on his behalf means that a day that should have been a day of a ticker tape parade, a great celebration, a party in the streets, is turning into a day of mourning as if they had lost this battle. And of course, that cannot ultimately be good for the kingdom, for David, for any of those good things that should have resulted from it. So the people, rather than celebrating, are stealing back into the city, as if they were people ashamed who had sneaked away from a battlefield in cowardice. But the king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, my son." So the people who should have been rejoicing hear the king's lament, this wail, because as Nathan had said years earlier, the sword will not depart from your house, and now it's devoured another of his sons. Joab saw what this meant. This is kind of a made-for-movies moment. Joab came into the house. I think maybe it should read stormed into the house where the king was and said, "Today you have disgraced all your servants, who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons, the lives of your daughters, the lives of your wives, the lives of your concubines." Absalom's treason had threatened all of those. And because David was now not even appreciating that, apparently in the least, Joab's assessment is he was behaving in a reprehensible fashion. Of course, Joab, for his part, probably didn't appreciate how deeply David was lamenting his own failings. He just thought David was going through grief over the loss of a son, which is a significant thing to experience, but David actually was dealing with more than that. But Joab just uncorked. "You love your enemies and hate your friends. You have declared today that you regard neither princes of high station or servants of low station. You don't care for any of them. Today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died, that would have made you very happy. Now therefore you go out and speak comfort to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you don't go out, not one will stay with you this night. It'll be worse for you than every evil you've experienced from the beginning of your youth until now." Joab turns around, storms out, slams the door behind him, and there's David. Well, he got through. And David arose, sat in the gate, and they told the people, saying, "There's the king, sitting in the gate." And all the people came before the king. Everyone of Israel had fled. Those fighting for Absalom were gone. These are all the people that had fought for David. Well, Joab is speaking with a little bit of exaggeration, but he had to get the point across. He understood that only the most brutal, ruthless honesty was likely to save the kingdom. If David continued in his present course, all would be lost. So, once David was in the gate, this public place of gathering, the people came. David expresses his thanks to them, and probably, following Joab's counsel, saved the kingdom from anarchy and civil war. The others, those who would have been the enemies, of course, are absent. They will be dealt with later, as we're going to see. One said, private grief was in danger of sabotaging public good. Joab was right, as the king whose throne had been preserved by the courageous actions of his loyal troops. David could not afford to give the impression that his anger over the death of his son outweighed his gratitude for the salvation of the kingdom. Loyalty should never be treated as disloyalty. So just a couple of concluding thoughts here. One, reflecting on Absalom and his monument. There are many ways to work at leaving a lasting legacy. But the legacy that is most to be desired and most to be admired is not that of monuments, but of ministry to those in need. I've been to a lot of memorial services, as have all of you in this church and elsewhere. And sometimes I've been to memorial services of people that have left great monuments in this city, and I have no objection to that. We should be appreciative of people that have been builders in this city and have left lasting and positive improvements to it as a result. But I'm going to tell you, I think you'll agree with me, that we are all more deeply moved in those settings when we hear that a person, whether they were well known or not, was a person who did quiet acts of pure love in the background, expecting no recognition at all, and then it comes to light later. What a person of service they were, not because they were trying to get accolades, public applause, but just out of heartfelt desire to reach out and be of service to those in need. And our hearts are moved by that, and we shed tears sometimes when we hear of it. Absalom wanted to build a big monument, but it was the wrong kind of monument, and it left not this wonderful expression of how great he was, but a miserable tribute to what a failure he had been in the final analysis. There are many ways to present the gospel to the world, but the good news of the gospel will be robbed of its potency if we shrink from proclaiming the whole counsel of God. The most famous sermon in the history of America is called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I don't know how many times I've heard it said, that's just a typical Puritan hellfire sermon. It is not. It is a sermon on the grace of God. And if you go back and read it with that in mind, you'll see it, because it screams off the page, every page of that sermon. The whole point Jonathan Edwards is saying is, we are sinful people who deserve God's wrath right now. Right now, we deserve to experience God's wrath. And what is it that keeps us from the wrath of God? It's the hands of God. It's sinners in the hands, and Edwards means the gracious, merciful hands of God, who is protecting us and preserving us one day to the next so that we don't experience the wrath that we so richly deserve. That's a powerful message. It got through to those folks living back there in 1740, who heard it for the first time, but it's one that we should all at least be thinking about. It's what Paul was saying in Romans 1. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Then it makes us appreciate, now has been revealed the grace of God in the gospel, you see. And one, in contrast to the other, becomes a very different message from simply a kind of a syrupy message of God, just sort of indiscriminately loving, and there's no sense of holiness or righteousness about him. And finally, there are many ways to experience pain in a lifetime, but the deepest pain is generally felt in the aftermath of disobedience to God's will, God's call to live a righteous life. Every one of us in this room has experienced pain, and sometimes deep, agonizing pain over the loss of loved ones, other circumstances. I've experienced pain. I will tell you honestly, and I think you might agree if you wanted to address the same question, the most painful experiences I have had in my life were the painful experiences that were the result of my own doing, my own bad choices. Because there's an additional pain in such a loss, knowing that it was my disobedience to doing something when I knew better that brought about this crushing sense of the anguish and lament that we sometimes have in life. That's what David was going through here, and so we can appreciate why he would lament his son, because in some ways he is at the same time. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Our Father, we thank you that you are a God who intervenes in history, who tells a story of your own authorship. And while we flail around sometimes and don't quite know what we should do or how we should do it, you nevertheless are bringing out of all of these missteps a perfect design and plan which culminates in Christ, so that all of history will be joined together in Him, and that all of it will be to the praise of His name. And it's in His name we pray and give you thanks for this time together now. Amen.